Hello, everyone. So today we are going to learn or understand the basic concept of communication. Communication, when we talk about communication, we mean that it is transfer of ideas, thoughts, and expression ourselves. It can be between persons, it can be within us, it can be among group of person. And throughout this slide, we would like to understand how communication takes place, or what is it actually. To move ahead, the first idea of communication, or the basic concept of communication, is that communication is social interaction through which messages, which are statements about events, ideas, issues, personalities, and above all, messages relating to socio-economic benefits are shared or transferred. By that, what we mean is these products of socio-economic benefits, which are exchanged in a process of communication, are the ones which are important to the dominance of the society, which again means that we communicate on those social or economically relatable aspects which are useful, which are needed for the basic existence of human beings and for the basic survival instincts. Besides humans, even communication happens between animals. Everyone, in order to live, in order to exist, they need to communicate. Our basic need for hunger has to be communicated as well to someone, or internally, so that we can prepare food, or we can order food, or we can ask for food for someone. So communication exists in all levels. Communication is something which is more than just mere exchange. It is also not static. Communication is something which is dynamic, which is a process of sharing ideas, our goals, our aspirations, our attitudes, our knowledge, our feelings with someone or amongst many. When we talk about communication, we have to understand what is the meaning of it. Now, communication involves all these activities such as dreaming, talking, thinking, speaking in public, reading a newspaper, watching TV programs, things which we do regularly, even writing, drawing, dancing, sharing a poetry, everything forms a part of communication through which we exchange our thoughts, our emotions, our passions. And through this communication, we look to satisfy our physical, emotional, and to some extent, this forms an integral part of our day-to-day life. We cannot probably survive without communication. Like, obviously, we have to talk to someone. We think a lot about our actions, about our goals, about what should we do about a particular thing. We also speak in public often, or in a very intimate gathering also, we speak, we share our ideas. Not to forget even dreaming, which is mostly a reflection of what our subconscious mind thinks. That is also communication, because we dream only when we think of certain things. And to be very, very particular, communication at a large level involves reading newspapers, watching TV programs, or interacting through social media, WhatsApping, liking each other's posts through Facebook or Instagram. All of this are part and parcel of communication. It is the process of constantly being engaged in sharing thoughts with someone or the other. We cannot exist probably without this process, and if communication with one person cease to exist, naturally we move on and we start communicating with someone else. So now we have a more or less idea that what exactly is meant by communication. And we do this not just through verbal talkings or writings always, even in a non-verbal method. We often use expressions, gestures, signs, codes to communicate with each other. They speak a lot, even what our verbal communication, wherever our verbal communication is inadequate perhaps, or it's not required to that extent. Next, we have to understand how we communicate. Now, communication is something which or where we express ourselves. So naturally, there is an exchange of information which happens between, that can happen between or amongst persons, groups, and institutions, or through mass media channel. Now, obviously, it can happen at a personal level when two friends chat. That is definitely communication. It can happen amongst persons or amongst groups or institutions. We may chat in a group of friends, or we deliver a lecture, a symposium, that is communication. It can happen in an institutional basis, or obviously it can happen through mass media, which involves the print media, the newspaper, the magazines, the electronic media, which comprise of radio and television, and more recently, the social media network or the internet, which has facilitated to so many applications that are operating based on communication, which has kind of opened floodgates of communication beyond the care for transnational borders. Communication today are happening smoothly across borders between two continents, as smoothly as it would have happened if two persons would have been sitting in front or together. Communication has, or it has, the technology has enabled communication to become seamless, to become uninterrupted, to become like real-time exchange, even in the virtual situation. And the COVID scenario has put out some beautiful examples, of course, one through e-learning or such kind of video setups, which proves that how communication today is overpowering our need for existence, just like we need probably food to eat, water to drink. Communication can also take place within one's own self. This is a very important, or at the base of all communication, this is what exists in case of human communication. We are always in a process of thinking or contemplating, that we speak to each other, though it takes a very little time or probably uncountable, but we think within our own selves, and that is when we are sure of the ideas, when we have some intentions, then we start communication. The process might take place even faster than at the time I'm taking to explain, but it also is communication, and that communication is at the base of all kinds of human communication. We introspect on our actions, we think what should we do, we reflect on our activities, we proceed or we plan, we strategize. Everything forms a part of communication with our own self. Having said that, we move to the types of communication. Types of communication means, of course, on one hand, we have the verbal communication and the non-verbal communication, which means verbal communication is when spoken words, languages are used through the mechanism of voice, and non-verbal means when we communicate through only signs and symbols. Besides, in order to understand the types of communication on these parameters, there are 4 categories. The first being intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication, group communication, and finally, mass communication. In our ordeal to understand each one of it, let us first take intrapersonal communication. As mentioned just a few minutes back, intrapersonal communication is communication with one's own self. It is individuals' reflection, contemplation, and meditation. It is a process of thinking. It is where we introspect about our own selves. We think of our actions. Here, we are the sender and we are the receivers ourselves. In such process, we actually start this kind of thinking or introspections, or we try to reflect on our own actions or plan our strategies primarily after receiving a stimuli. This stimuli can be external, it can be received through our senses, or it can be very much intimate. Now, this stimuli, it is to some extent converted in the form of electric impulses, which is sent to our brain while traveling through our central nervous system. Our brain then makes a decision whether to continue think about the thought process or whether to discard it completely and think about something else. Point is that whenever we are reading something, we are walking alone, we are sitting quietly, even we are dreaming, we are smiling to our own selves, we are actually involved in intrapersonal communication. The next is interpersonal communication. This is the most direct face-to-face communication, which obviously takes place between at least two persons. It can go up to 3 or 4 persons at the max. When it is between 2, it is generally known as dyadic, amongst 3, triadic, and amongst 4, quadrupic. This interpersonal communication is the most personal, direct, and intimate communication. It can go up to personal or intimate level depending on the level of bond we share with the person we communicate. We generally involve all our senses, that of gesturing, touching, speaking, writing, drawing, while we communicate in the interpersonal level. At the initial stage, or which we often call as phatic stage of communication, interpersonal communication starts with a formal introduction, which begins with just an hi, hello, probably. And as we move on to the course of conversation, if we strike a chord with the person we are interacting, it is likely that we move on to the second stage, which is a more personal stage, and which is where we are likely to open up about each other a little more, like talking about our profession, our health, our family. And we are willing to reveal a little bit and take off our social guard. Finally, we move to an intimate stage, which is mostly reserved for our friends and families. We are more and more open, or we are likely to speak about our personal issues, our private affairs, our secrets deep down, and allow the other person to give us feedback on the same. Feedback is a very buzzword in interpersonal communication. It is so important that at a point it can be hardly understood as who is the initiator of communication and as to who has been a receiver. It becomes such a cycle and it becomes such a continuous process that it's hard to understand the sender as well as the receivers. What seems to fall short in such kind of communication, especially if it has moved on to intimate stage. Thirdly, we have the group communication, which is, as the name suggests, it is amongst few people, which of course has to be 5 or more than that. Group communication can be also of 2 types, micro and macro group. In case of micro group, it can be 15 to 20 participants, and the examples of such kind of group communication are symposiums, workshops, small level seminars, and where in most of the situation, the sender is known to everyone, and it's likely, depending on the member of the groups, the receivers are equally known to the sender. Feedback is in a lesser manner compared to interpersonal communication, but it still exists. It depends how much lenient the group leader is, who will allow for feedback to come and to respond as well. However, in case of macro group communication, which from the name suggests that it involves a large number of people, a large group of people, feedback is almost non-existent. This kind of macro group communications are very common or very much identifiable in a large meeting. For instance, political meeting. In such instances, the public address systems like microphones, soundbox, such things can be used. And in such cases, obviously the sender, the person who has some messages to share with the others, is definitely known to the receivers. However, the members of the receivers or the audience, they are hardly known to the, personally, they are hardly known to the sender. The examples in such cases can be, of course, theater audiences, religious services, dance performances, carnivals such as Kumbh Mela are classic examples of group communication. Finally, we come to the fourth type of communication, which is mass communication. While a communication process might start with intrapersonal communication at the base, the highest level is mass communication. It involves spreading messages to an extended mass audience through rapid means of production and distribution at relatively inexpensive cost. Mass communication, as the name suggests, is that form of communication where the sender interacts with a large member of audience, often heterogeneous and anonymous audience. They are hardly known to each other or even to the receiver. They represent a large heterogeneous audience composition. Message reproduction and distribution in such cases are very fast. However, the cost of exposure for such kind of messages are generally very low. This kind of communication takes place through the mass media platforms, which we often know as newspapers, radio, magazines, television, the internet, social media, and so on. This kind of mass media messages are generally one way. And in such cases, feedback is almost non-existent. Or even if it is there at all, it is indirect and very much delayed. However, such messages are timed in a very, very perfect manner so that each member of this audience group receives the message simultaneously at the same time, not depending on the geographic location as such. That moves us to elements of communication. This particular illustration represents an entire communication process which have got the elements presented here. The process starts with source. A source is also known as the sender in communication model. A sender is one, or a source is one, who initiates the communication, who has got a fair bit of idea what he or she wants to share. A sender or a source can be anybody who has got some idea, who has got some concept, and which has got some intentions to be communicated to the receiver. The communicator or the source or the sender has to be enough effective to not just have a concept, but to encode the message to be able to share. This encoding process may involve languages, codes, signs, or written words, diagrams, any form of code which helps the other person to understand the meaning. Of course, such codes have to be universally accepted, or at least accepted between the two members who are present in the communication. Even codes can be pictures. Basically, this encoding helps the message to transform into a form of signal and enables it to pass through channel. Now, transmission of message, which is the core idea, message is the core idea or the intention which is being transferred. This transmission cannot happen in a vacuum. Transmission needs a proper channel, which may be simple air when it is two-way, when it is a communication which is happening between two persons, as in the case of interpersonal communication, or a small group communication when people are chatting in a room. It can be simple air which acts as the channel or medium for communicating. However, it can be as much as complex, such as the mass media channels, which helps the message to travel through a huge space and distance, which is not possible through air. Channels can be equally the normal public address system involving microphones and the receiving sets. The channel enables the transmission of message to transmit from the sender to the receiver. Next, we have decoding and reception or receiver. Decoding can be understood as a device as well as a person's brain. Decoding can act as a device as well as a function. A device of decoding, as in the case of telephone conversation, a receiving handset might act as a decoder, which will transfer the signal into the spoken language as used by the source, for the receiver to understand the message in the same manner, in the same feeling, or with the same intention as had been communicated by the sender. Decoder can also be our brains when human-to-human communication is taking place without the use of any kind of industrial channel, such as mass media. In case of interpersonal communication, our decoding device can be initially our ears as well as our brains, which process the message and tries to make us understand that what the message has been intended with. If there is problem in decoding of such messages, it might give rise to misconception, misunderstanding, lot of interruptions. Hence, decoding process forms a very vital part, similarly just as encoding. Finally, it is the receiver who is the final destination of the message. Sometimes it is very difficult to separate decoder to receiver. It may act as the same person, or there can be device which might help for that. Decoding is actually understanding of the message, and it is the receiver who understands this message and can give a feedback or action that follows the message. After receiving a message, one would have an effect formed about the particular reception. The response towards that message is known as feedback, which is shared to the source. In case of interpersonal communication, feedback is just instant. It does not need any third party to reach the sender. It can be smooth, it can be seamless, and it can be produced at that moment. However, in case of macro group communication or mass communication as such, feedback generally is very difficult to measure or is hardly existent. Hence, this explains the complete process in which a communication takes place. Of course, the environment has to be congenial. This process of communication helps messages to be sent from the source to the subjects intended. communication have got various roles in the society. Communication informs. Communication helps interpret events. Communication helps overcome negativity or misunderstanding. Communication helps adapt people to the changing opinions, to the changing social issues or dogmas or taboos. Communication helps us understand the products of socioeconomic benefit for us. Communication helps our minds to get enthusiastic in order to see a particular thing from a particular point of view. Communication helps better our lives. Communication can be therapeutic as well. Communication helps us to get self-education, and obviously even for formal education, we use communication. And not to forget, it is through communication we receive entertainment or recreation. For even to promote our culture or ourselves or to motivate people, communication is the single most valuable thing which might help people to interact for the bestest in interest. Discussions, debates are instrumental functions in democracy, which helps us to not live lives as social isolates or aliens and to come together and form a coherent society where we can benefit from each other and we help the society to grow as a whole, in leading into an integrated, function, active society. With that, I would like to end this course of learning here and look forward to sharing more.